Beyond the Gates spoilers tease that Chelsea goes live and the internet leans in the way it always does, hungry for confession, spectacle, and the raw edges of truth. The tease is a small thing in itself, a thumbnail, a caption, a countdown that flickers across millions of feeds. But the moment the red live dot blooms, it becomes something larger, amplified by collective attention and the strange, tender cruelty of followers who have never met the person they claim to know. Chelsea understands that better than most. She's spent years learning to translate her life into bite-sized moments that are easy to like, easy to share, and easier to misunderstand. She arrives at the camera tonight with makeup that has been applied carefully, not to hide but to armor. The ring light makes tiny constellations in her pupils. There is a tremor in her voice that she has tried all week to iron out. Whatever steadiness she displays is chosen, a small, deliberate performance of control. She starts like someone easing into a conversation with a room full of strangers who might as well be family. The chat balloons cascade in the sidebar: hearts, flames, 1,000 "we love you" messages. Naomi sits off camera, a steady presence, her thumb rubbing the back of Chelsea's hand when needed, a human metronome. Naomi had been the one to say the hard thing 2 nights earlier: "You don't have to shrink to make someone else comfortable." Naomi's voice had been calm, insistently pragmatic. She had seen the pattern and named it without flourish: "You survived this. Don't let the fear be the loudest thing in your life. Tell it your way." That counsel lands like a key in a rusted lock. Chelsea's idea comes in the hush that follows Naomi's sentence of vivid, terrible clarity. Instead of retreating, instead of hiding the scar, she will trace it, with the aim of desanctifying it. She will reduce the power it has to surprise and terrify her again. Her plan is not solely about catharsis. It is tactical. If the story of what happened to her becomes the thing she tells on her terms, it becomes a shield. The broadcast will be both narrative and safety manual, confession and checklist. In a landscape where cameras often commodify suffering, she wants to reframe her own. She begins by setting the scene for the audience in a way she knows intimately how to do. Not with exposition but with sensation. She describes the ordinary evening that preceded the extraordinary event: sticky warmth of summer trapped in a taxi at midnight, the way the driver had hummed a song into his closed window, the pocket-sized glow of her phone as she scrolled through comments and missed the small signs that aggregated into danger. She admits to naivete, to the way a performer sometimes interprets attention as affirmation rather than threat. She admits to mistakes with the rawness of someone undoing the myth of perfection. The chat erupts and she reads some lines aloud: "We would have protected you and it wasn't your fault." The words are bomb and indictment both. Her recounting of the kidnapping is careful and cinematic but never lurid. She slows down and describes the small betrayals: the softening of a smile into intent, the way a hand that had once rested on her shoulder found a new, more insistent place. She talks about the sound of the boots on concrete and the texture of the jacket that smelled like old cigarettes. She recalls the cold light in the eyes of the person who had convinced her to get into a car and how obstacles that once would have seemed like red flags were rationalized away because desire and ambition and loneliness often signpost the exits we don't take. She tells the camera about the moment when the world shrank to one decision point and how the decision was made not by heroics but by the accrual of small errors. She also names Allison. The name lands in the feed and compels 100 new lines of speculation. For some in the chat, Allison is a cipher. For others, the name fills in a whole narrative they've been constructing for months. Chelsea chooses the language of truth but not vengeance. She characterizes Allison in exact terms: a person whose devotion had mutated into ownership, whose admiration had turned possessive. Chelsea resists the temptation to mythologize Allison as monstrous, because monsters are an easy story and often distract from the more uncomfortable fact that harm can live entirely inside human contradictions. She describes how Allison had once been a friend, a collaborator whose flattery had smoothed Chelsea's path, how Allison's jealousy had emerged slowly as a cold calculus, a subtraction of others from Chelsea's orbit until only Allison remained both witness and jailer. The idea that her abduction came as a direct result of visibility, that the very thing that had given Chelsea a platform also made her a target, becomes the fulcrum of the broadcast. Chelsea doesn't perform victimhood for effect. Instead, she recalibrates the narrative of peril into a pedagogy. She lists what she wishes she'd known and what she has learned since. These are mundane things: location sharing turned off, outlets in public places noticed, the identification of exits in any room, the names of close friends who have permission to be contacted in an emergency. But her presentation is not merely checklist. She tells the story of each item, anchors the advice in lived experience. When she says, "Look at the exits," she remembers the way she had not looked at them the night she was taken, how she had failed to notice the narrow corridor that would have provided a route to a crowded street. The chat responds with screenshot and bookmark and 1,000 digital affirmations. But the broadcast is also more than instruction, it is testimony. Chelsea allows herself to describe the feeling of being watched, how time stretches into elastic and memory becomes a room of mirrors where every reflection warps into blame. She speaks of shame, particular shame of visibility after violation, the fear that the narrative will turn and she will be not the person who was hurt but the person who somehow invited it. This, she says, is the part she is most determined to dismantle. "I did not earn this because I was careless," she tells them. "I was exploited because someone chose to exploit me." Naomi squeezes her hand in the background, and the camera catches the motion as if to underline that a story told cannot be undone but can be held, understood, contextualized. The first hour of the stream becomes a kind of séance for reality. Viewers from across continents send in messages of solidarity. People the algorithm previously matched with Chelsea's brand of candor and curated domesticity. Some messages are raw with emotion, others clinical and sharp, offering links and resources. A handful of critical voices begin to burble, skeptical, performative, the internet's necessary antagonists. But Chelsea keeps the line between defensiveness and disclosure as fine as a whisper. Her underlying goal is never to turn the chat into a courtroom. It is to make her own testimony incontrovertible. She shares evidence: a set of photos she took covertly in the days before the abduction that, viewed now, look like a constellation of warnings, a voicemail she saved, a location ping that begins to map the geometry of what happened. She uploads them live, and the interface accepts the files, and the audience sees the same images that actual law enforcement will later use. The broadcast becomes simultaneously a public diary and a security measure. The more people who know the contours of her story, the harder it becomes for a single falsehood to take root. Naomi watches the chat and watches Chelsea in a tight, double focus. Naomi's joy is a complex thing, partly relief and partly the satisfaction of having steered someone away from surrender. Her voice is practical, sometimes blunt. This is the only way to take power back, being the narrator of your own life. She had known, in a way that mothers and mentors do, that trauma often insists on a very particular defeat, slow folding in of identity until the person who survived is a lighter, diminished version of themselves. She is elated because Chelsea's decision to go live is an act of reconstitution. It is also, Naomi recognizes, a risk. Public exposure invites vitriol and misinterpretation. The camera is a double-edged instrument of recovery and spectacle. Naomi's elation rests on the belief that the risk is worth it. Chelsea's agency, once reclaimed, will outweigh the noise. Danny watches from a distance that is both physical and psychic. She is Chelsea's mother, but she is also a woman who, for a long time, folded her life around the needs and anxieties of her child. She had never been tender with herself in the way she had been with Chelsea. For months she had slept with the lamp on, listening to footsteps that were not real. Her world had narrowed to a set of hypervigilant rituals, checking locks again and again, asking for updates with an anxious steadiness that can only come from someone who is trying to control the uncontrollable. Watching Chelsea speak tonight is an encounter with a child who has grown into a person who can hold trauma without letting it define every choice moving forward. When Chelsea tells the camera that she will not quit her work because of one person's cruelty, The words land for Dani like an exhale. Part of her had been waiting for the moment when she could encourage Chelsea to retreat into safety, give up, step back, let the public life that had made her a target dissolve. But she recognizes the cost of such a retreat. To ask Chelsea to disappear would be to permit Allison to have a victory larger than any punitive measure could extract. Dani understands, with the fierce clarity of someone who has watched the arc of a daughter's life, that protection sometimes looks like empowerment. Seeing Chelsea narrate the event removes some small part of Dani's anxiety. It reframes the narrative into one of agency and choice. The relief is soft and moral. It does not erase fear, but it dilutes it. In the privacy of her kitchen, Dani allows herself to imagine a different future: dinners that do not end with a check-in text, walks without a phone clutched like a talisman. She decides, in a quiet, stubborn way, that she will reclaim a part of life she had sidelined: her own companionship and domestic tenderness. There is someone, a person in Dani's orbitava whose patient affection had been waiting, quietly hopeful. Dani feels, for the first time in months, the possibility of loving and being loved without the pull of constant watchfulness. The knowledge that Chelsea is choosing not to hide catalyzes Dani's own small rebellion. She will take time for herself, let the ache of vigilance recede, and allow a new tenderness to grow. Back on screen, Chelsea recognizes the duality of her role: survivor and educator, spectacle and living, breathing person. She admits to the audience the trembling that sometimes still steals in uninvited, and she offers techniques that have helped her. Things that are mundane but, described with care, feel like rituals of claiming. She demonstrates a grounding exercise, placing her palm on the webcam as if touching the viewers. She breathes, in a cadence that invites communal participation. She suggests a practical protocol: set a friend as your emergency contact, share a screenshot of your ride before you get in, check the exits when you enter a room. She speaks of boundaries: show to say no, how to listen to that small internal voice that often knows more than we let it. Her instructions are both about bodily safety and about emotional economy, small acts that accumulate into a more robust life. There are moments of humor, too, because Chelsea is alive and alive people make room for levity. She jokes about the absurdity of algorithms, about how a morning coffee can trend more reliably than heartbreak. Her laughter is an act of steadfastness. The jokes are small calibrations that remind both her and the viewers that a life cannot be entirely subsumed by trauma. The internet sees this and responds with 1,000 small amusements, memes about the ring light, parodies. But within the flood of reaction, there is a core of people who listen with attention that resembles kinship. A few send in their own stories, notes of survival, short messages about how a shared tip prevented worse things. A young person somewhere confesses via DM that they are being stalked and that Chelsea's protocol helped them reach out for help. The platform, for a moment, delivers on a rare promise, that a public confessional can lead to private, life-saving action. Chelsea's narrative strategy also includes ritualized exposure. She invites 3 guests onto the stream: people who were present in peripheral ways, a former colleague, a barista who noticed something odd the night of the abduction, a cybersecurity expert who can talk through the small, technical steps viewers can take to protect themselves online. Each person is introduced with a sensitivity that Chelsea insists upon. Names are given with consent, and no one's story is used as spectacle. The cybersecurity expert speaks in plain language and gives concrete steps to two-factor authentication, how to manage location permissions, while the barista offers a tiny, poignant anecdote about how a polite question in a crowded cafe can be a low-cost intervention. The collective testimony turns the broadcast into a little community of practice, where knowledge is transferred in the form of real, usable habits. Technically, the stream is a marvel of improvisation. Chelsea's producer, an earnest, anxious figure named Marco, monitors the back-end and filters malicious comments. He toggles closed captions and ensures that support hotlines are pinned at the top of the chat. Naomi coordinates off-camera, keeping an eye on Chelsea's pulse and pace, signaling when to take breaks. The production is an ecosystem, human and digital creatures that thrive when they are attentive to each other's needs. The stream's viewership balloons past the million mark, a notion of faces and usernames trickling into the margins of the screen. There is a peculiar intimacy inherent in that scale, anonymity and exposure braided together. Chelsea occasionally reads aloud long messages from viewers who tell her what her livestream meant to them, and in that practice she creates a feedback loop of solidarity. Notably, the broadcast does not aim to identify Allison to the public as a method of revenge. Chelsea avoids the digital theater of the witch hunt. Instead, she frames Allison as an example of how attachment can be weaponized, how social media ecosystems can cultivate dangerous intensity. She insists on structural explanations, how parasocial relationships can metastasize into stalking, how platforms can enable access without accountability. In doing so, she resists the temptation to personalize all harm into a single villain. She wants the audience to take away not a simple narrative of good versus bad but a clearer understanding of the social dynamics that make such events possible. Conversation in the chat turns philosophical, then practical again. Viewers argue about the ethics of live streaming trauma, about whether broadcasting one's pain is empowering or exploitative. Chelsea listens and engages with a moderation that is surprisingly diplomatic. She says she understands both sides. She admits that live streaming feels naked and that she is aware of the risks. But she returns to a central conviction: the story of someone's suffering should no longer be controlled by those who would keep their mouths shut out of fear. Public testimony, she argues, can be a form of public safety if framed and managed responsibly. She invites discussion, invites dissent, keeps the microscope hovering over the nuance. As the night deepens, Chelsea begins to talk about what came after the abduction, the weeks when public scrutiny felt like a second captivity, the interviews where questions seemed to probe for drama rather than truth, the moments of loneliness that were both private and performative. She confesses to a period where she considered leaving the career that had once lit up like a constellation in her life. Allison's betrayal had cut deep, she says, and the idea of stepping back felt deceptively alluring, to retreat inward, to stop being visible and thereby stop being vulnerable. Naomi had, in that moment, argued against surrender. Her words, the ones that Naomi speaks in the quiet flashback montage, are gentler now than they had been in the original conversation. Naomi had told her that bravery is not always the loud act of standing in front of a camera. Sometimes it is the quiet, sovereign decision to continue until the fear no longer chooses her. That decision animates Chelsea. She explains to her audience that choosing to stay visible is itself a reclamation. There is risk, yes. And there is also a form of sovereignty that comes when one refuses to let a singular violent act define the trajectory of a life. She frames the choice as both personal and political. By continuing to perform the things she loves, she decreases the leverage of those who sought to wield fear as a tool. The chat is raw and tender. The internet applauds with cash tips and emojis and an avalanche of supportive messages. Among those messages are older posts from Allison's followers, some bewildered, some angry. Chelsea reads a few aloud and responds in blunt empathy, refusing to be baited into a brand of public retribution she does not want to become. She thanks those who stayed, consoles those who were triggered, and points to resources for people who need help now. At one point, a live camera on Chelsea's street registers a shadow crossing the frame. Because of the stream's nature, 1,000 small attentions notice the anomaly before it culminates into anything. Marco flags security. Naomi tenses. Danny, watching from her kitchen, nearly chokes on her tea. But the shadow is resolved. A delivery driver, a misclicked stream overlay, and the relief is collective and electric. The moment underscores, in a cinematic way, the precariousness that vibrates around Chelsea's life. The internet is both sentinel and amplifier. This duality becomes a running meditation throughout her telling. In the lull between the heavier moments, Chelsea invites viewers to imagine the future with her. She talks about projects she still wants to pursue, small ambitions that have nothing to do with the notoriety of her story, a podcast about everyday courage, a collaborative art series, a modest retreat for survivors where safety comes first. She maps out tentative timelines and invites people to join the work not as consumers but as participants in a different kind of online community, one that doesn't monetize trauma but invests in safety. Her language is practical and visionary at once. Every sentence carries the weight of someone who wants to transform personal pain into collective learning. The chat responds with ideas and offers of help: people in the tech world volunteering anonymized expertise, therapists offering sliding scale sessions, a local community center offering to host a pilot workshop. Naomi smiles when Chelsea announces the idea of a survivor retreat. The smile is private and enormous. For Naomi, Chelsea's intentions are a form of repair, not just for herself but for the social fabric that allowed the harm to occur. Naomi had worried that telling this story publicly would reduce Chelsea to an anecdote, but instead it seems to catalyze a network of people who want to build something safer. Naomi's joy multiplies, pride in Chelsea's courage, gratitude that her advice nudged Chelsea toward this moment, and a quiet, buoyant hope that the future might hold a different shape, one in which Chelsea's name is associated not only with pain but with repair and leadership. As the night winds toward an inevitable end, Chelsea prepares to sign off. She reads a sentence she has rehearsed 100 times: "This is not the end of the story. It's the beginning of a new chapter where I tell it." The viewers respond with a ferocious kindness. Donations ping in for causes Chelsea supports. Moderators pin resources for people in immediate danger. Naomi leans in, cueing the last segment: practical follow-ups, what to do in the immediate days following a disclosure. Chelsea lists contacts and reminds people that calling in-state hotlines is an immediate step if they're in crisis. Danny watches, feeling a strange, hopeful lightness she hasn't experienced in months. The fear is not gone, but it is reordered. She is ready, quietly, to pick up a conversation she had postponed with Ava. For now, however, the broadcast is a living testament. Chelsea signs off, thanking everyone for the hour, for the trust, for the vulnerability shared across screens and time zones. The red live dot vanishes like a small, slightly wounded heart. The stream transforms into a saved video that will ripple outward, rewatched and remixed and dissected. For Chelsea, the night is a navigation of liminal space between privacy and publicity, between fear and action. Naomi, Danny, Marka, they each breathe as if some burdened weight has been shifted. But the story is not done. The night has given them something crucial: a narrative reclaimed, a plan in the motion, and an audience that might, if they steward it well, be the first line of a new kind of protection. There is, though, a lingering tremor that no broadcast can smooth entirely. As Chelsea steps away from the camera and into the quieter rooms of her apartment, she notices something on the window pane, a faint smear, and next to it a scrap of paper that had not been there before the stream: a piece of cardboard with a phone number scrawled in a looping hand. The light catches it, the number blooms into a small, stubborn question. She picks it up with fingers that are steady for the first time in months, and the camera's saved file continues to upload, the world continuing to watch even as she steps into a moment that feels private but may not be. Her breath catches, halfway between the resolve that carried her through the live stream and the ancient, animal memory that once learned to notice shadows. The phone number is familiar in its format, in 3 digits that match the city code where everything had happened, and the letters beside it are cramped and hurried: remember,